Welcome to video 1. This is the beginning of a discussion of the history of economic thought. Some of you have taken classes in the history of economic thought, and you presumably think you know what that means. But today, I want to talk a little bit about historiography, okay? The way in which you do history. And in the case of history of thought, there are two main approaches. The first is called a rational reconstruction, or an internalist approach. This is, in fact, the conventional approach to the history of economic thought. And it goes something like this. You acknowledge that there was economic thinking before Adam Smith, but systematic thinking about economics begins with Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And from this perspective, Smith got a lot of things right. And then it proceeds to go through the classical economists, Malthus and Ricardo, and many other figures, and then it ends the classical period with John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx. And then there is a break, and there is what is called the marginalist revolution. Okay, and main figures there are Karl Menger, Leon Walras, which is how you say your name when it's spelled walrus, and most importantly, William Stanley Jevons and an American economist named John Bates Clark. And these are the people who introduced the concept of utility, okay? And this is seen as an improvement over valuing things based on their labor content, like the classical economists did. Now we value things based on their value to the consumer during the act of consumption. And this goes forward and culminates in Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics in 1899. And this becomes standard economics, modern economics. Now, with Alfred Marshall, we're talking about what we would all identify as microeconomics. There is effectively no macroeconomics. So economics develops in the marginalist tradition, and that's all that economics is the marginalist tradition, up until the publication of the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money by John Maynard Keynes in the 1940s. 1936, I think, is the date, but we'll talk about this in more detail later. Now, Keynes makes the innovation of adding analysis of the economy in aggregate categories like national income, consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. So we're looking now at the aggregate level rather than individual behavior. And this is seen as an improvement in that aspect of economics. And these are combined, this marginalist microeconomics and Keynes's macroeconomics, into what we call the neoclassical synthesis. The neoclassical synthesis is really pretty much a function of the work of Paul Samuelson in his textbook, where he puts both of these things in his textbook. All right, marginalist analysis and macroeconomic analysis, and he combines them into the economics you took today. And then that has been the mainstream of economics since the Keynesian revolution. And economics then has continued to improve and improve and improve to the very perfection it is today, in the opinion of the person who wrote that history of thought. Notice, it begins with Adam Smith, and Smith almost has everything right. And then it goes through time, and we look at changes in economics as a process of continuous improvement up until the author reaches their own economics today. So it's a nice linear scientific growth, and that's all there is present in the history of thought. All right, that's called a rational reconstruction. And generally speaking, it is the main thrust of the argument that is made in most history of economic thought classes and in many characterizations of the history of economic thought in the textbooks you would have encountered in microeconomics and macroeconomics. Even the terms microeconomics and macroeconomics are part of the neoclassical synthesis. Well, marginalist economics was referred to price theory. Macroeconomics was called income analysis. So it's not until they are combined in the same textbook in the neoclassical synthesis that we call them microeconomics and macroeconomics. There is a whole second approach, all right? And we call this the conflicting views approach. And what it really means is conflicting views on the economy drive change in the discipline of economics. And this is an externalist history, right? It's not told as a linear story. It's much more complex. First of all, it tends to spend a lot more time on precursors to Adam Smith, but eventually it does begin with Adam Smith in 1776, and it begins to move forward. The classical economists it focuses on most are Ricardo and Malthus, okay? You're going to know more about these folks, but Malthus and Ricardo had a conflict about how they understood classical economics. There were a lot of people who didn't agree with how classical economics ought to be done, but the two main camps were Ricardo and Malthus. So there was a conflict, and that conflict moved forward. It was never completely resolved, but the mainstream of economics that ends in the neoclassical synthesis followed the approach of Ricardo. Okay, now what were the two different approaches? Well, we're going to talk about that in detail when we talk about the classical economists in more detail. But Ricardo was interested in formal logical analysis, and Malthus, while also using formal logical analysis, looked at the particulars of history to understand them. The deductive method for Ricardo was sufficient. Deduction and induction were required by Malthus. And actually, that's more consistent with Adam Smith. But the economics tradition continued in this formalist deductivist way. All right, there were many economists who disagreed with this, but in the history of thought, they tend to be minor figures. The next major conflict really comes at the end of what we call classical economics, and this involves two different economists. The greatest of the classical economists, John Stuart Mill, and the last classical economist, his contemporary, Karl Marx. Now, both of these classical economists noted there were some problems in classical economics. And we're going to talk again about that. But as you probably suspect, Marx is going to be a breaking point with classical economics. Marx showed, using the labor theory value and approach of Ricardo, that economies, capitalist economies, he's the person who gave them the name capitalist economies, were exploitative of workers because of the labor theory of value, which contended that all value was created by labor. All right, so this was a contradiction, at least, or something unpleasant, unpalatable for the classical economists. So they began to look to find an alternative to the labor theory of value. And that's what marginalism is. So notice that marginalism did not spring as simply a better idea out of the development of classical economics. It is in response to a conflict of views within classical economics. And we get a branching here. We get the development of Marxian economics focused on capital accumulation, exploitation, and unstable capitalism. And then we get in the mainstream of economics, what remains part of the rational reconstruction, marginalist economics, which solves that problem by eliminating the labor theory of value and replacing it with the utility theory of value. Okay, I mentioned there were three marginalists from Europe and one, John Bates Clark from the United States. John Bates Clark invented marginal productivity theory, and he taught at Carleton College. And he had a student there who objected to the marginalist revolution and criticized it savagely. Okay, he said it was unscientific and argued that economics should be evolutionary rather than static. His name was Thorstein Veblen, and he is credited with the most trenchant criticism of marginalist economics. Okay. And he founded an alternative school of thought called institutional economics, which rejected marginalist economics in favor of an evolutionary approach to economics. One of the other actual marginalists, Karl Menger, eventually his students and followers rejected the mainstream of marginalist economics as well, adopting much of the notion of utility and thought and creating a school of thought even more conservative than the mainstream called Austrian economics. The major figure you might have heard of in Austrian economics is Friedrich Hayek, who wrote The Road to Serfdom. So actually, conflict with marginalist economics generated two additional branches of economic thought, Austrian economics and institutional economics. Okay. Now, if you follow marginalist economics to its logical conclusion, which we did in the early 20th century, a guy named Gerald de Brue, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, looked and asked the question, what happens if you add all the microeconomics up, all the markets? And can you find out if they are all in equilibrium at the same time? And the answer to that is yes, under a very restrictive set of assumptions. The possibility of general equilibrium was proven. Okay. The restrictions on that, on the assumptions, on that idea were so strong that by the 1930s, people already began to think it was useless. It was general equilibrium as a practical part of economics disappears in the early 1980s. Two things happen in the 1930s that are really important. The most important, of course, is Keynes, who rejects microeconomics, marginalist economics, of his teacher, Alfred Marshall, and constructs a whole new economics based on aggregates, what we call macroeconomics today. In microeconomics and general equilibrium, there can be no involuntary unemployment because the labor market always clears. In macroeconomics, the possibility of involuntary unemployment is explored. So again, you have a conflicting view over what happens when you look at the economy as a whole, general equilibrium or macroeconomics. So in fact, this is a split in economics, and Samuelson deals with that by cramming the two together. They don't really work very well together, but they are the mainstream of economics. And this has led to a constant call in the neoclassical synthesis defined the microeconomic foundations of macroeconomics. This is a misguided approach. It's called the fallacy of composition by Keynes. We'll get to that later. But the cramming of it together, of microeconomics and Keynesian macroeconomics together, did not sit well with Keynes and more particularly his students. Keynes died very young. They did not think, and his students and his contemporaries who were working with him in this area of macroeconomics, and they broke off from the mainstream and founded something called post-Keynesian economics, which harkens back to some of the important themes in Keynes that had to be pushed out of the neoclassical synthesis. One of the most important ones was uncertainty. All right. The mainstream of economics reduces uncertainty to measurable probabilistic risk. But in post-Keynesian economics, you have radical uncertainty, meaning that it is impossible to predict because there is no probability distribution known. So again, another school of thought grows off of a conflict in the mainstream. The next major break in economics actually begins with the second wave of feminism, and it is different from all the rest. It is different because it breaks with the idea of the rational atomistic individual who is the consumer and the firm in mainstream economics, all right? Homo economicus, which is Latin for economic man. So the economists who break away now are those who reject the idea of economic man. Indeed, they reject it as a highly gendered concept. So a feminist economics is developed out of that notion that gender matters in economic analysis, that you can't just look at everybody as if they were a commercial individual in 19th century England, all right? Behaving rationally in markets, choosing and producing, that in fact the gender of the actor, of the agent, is significant. That is the one premise they all share. All feminist economists believe gender is important, but they are unlike any other school of thought. They do have a conflict with the mainstream, and yet the one difference is that notion that gender matters. So feminist economists are sometimes mainstream economists. Sometimes they are Marxist economists. Sometimes they are institutional economists. There are even Austrian feminist economists and post-Keynesian feminist economists. So feminist economics is a big tent of economists using all the different approaches to economics to study the role of gender in the economy. That is the the conflicting view or crisis view of the history of economic thought, that there is always a main idea about how economics could be done and a series of critics looking at it, and in response to their criticism, economics changes. I mentioned another change in the 1930s. That was the addition to economics of game theory, which allowed for an analysis not of necessarily rational behavior, but of strategic behavior. Game theory is important in understanding games. It is also used in international relations to think about diplomacy, and it's used to think about how firms might strategize in non-competitive markets where there are alternative strategies that they can use in the case of monopolistic competition, oligopoly, or near monopoly. That has transformed the mainstream a bit, in that after 1980, the focus of mainstream microeconomics has largely been on the development of game theory and in modeling individuals who are not rational or not completely rational. They exercise bounded rationality. Now, that is a break with the past, but it has been incorporated into the mainstream. There are mainstream institutional economists who believe institutions are important, but they continue to use mainstream microeconomics to explore it. There are mainstream evolutionary economists who spend all their time modeling individual behavior to see if they can generate from their models institutions, and they even believe that it is competition among institutions which leads to the gradual selection of successful societies and successful institutions. Okay, so there is innovation in the mainstream. We went from classical to marginalist to game theory to the neoclassical synthesis. So even this rational reconstruction includes many of the conflicting views that were ultimately adopted, seen as an improvement, and that replaced the previous economics. Okay, so one of the reasons everything you see in political economy may be new to you is because the presentation to undergraduates of economics is largely a rational reconstruction. You learn micro, you learn macro, you learn statistics and econometrics so that you can model things in ways appropriate for micro and macro. And most of the applied classes, of course, will be mainstream classes. There are other classes in our curriculum because we're a pluralist department at Hobart and William Smith. So there are courses in Marxian economics, there are courses in institutional economics, there are courses in feminist economics. Some of our macro courses are post-Keynesian in character. And some of the topics courses, by virtue of which topics they study, have to step outside the mainstream of economics. Mainstream economics is referred to as mainstream economics. It's usually referred to as neoclassical economics, but that's problematic because that's not what the term means. There's a definitional issue, and it's sometimes referred to as orthodox economics. I think for purposes of this course, it's less confusing to use the term mainstream. The next thing we're going to talk about is this approach to the history of economic thought so that we can locate the role of political economy in the history of economic thought more accurately. Thanks for your attention, and thank you for bearing with me. This is my first ever video, and I don't want to edit it, so I'm obviously making some mistakes, but hopefully the narrative is clear. We, of course, can talk about this anytime in class.